The first thing anyone noticed wasn't that the gorilla was staring at the camera. It was that he never once looked away, even when everything around him changed. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Every morning at Ridge Valley Wildlife Park outside Denver, visitors gathered near the western habitat just after the gates opened. Children pointed at the massive silverback named Mason, expecting the usual display of strength or curiosity. Instead, they found something no one could explain. Mason sat perfectly still on a weathered limestone ledge, shoulders relaxed, breathing slow and steady, his dark eyes locked on a single security camera mounted above the viewing glass. He ignored the fresh fruit, placed only a few feet away. He ignored the chatter of school groups and the playful movements of the younger gorillas behind him. Even when his longtime keeper, Lucas Bennett, called his name in the calm voice Mason had recognized for years, the giant ape never shifted his gaze. At first, everyone laughed. Some guests joked that Mason liked being on camera. Others pulled out their phones, recording the strange scene as if it were another harmless internet moment. But by the third day, the laughter faded. By the fifth day, people stopped lingering near the glass. There was something unsettling about an animal that seemed less interested in the world around him than in watching a silent machine. Lucas reviewed Mason's health records again and again. The gorilla was eating enough at night, sleeping normally, and showed none of the warning signs of illness or stress. His heartbeat, appetite, and behavior with the rest of the troop remained surprisingly normal. Only one thing had changed. Every daylight hour, whenever that camera was powered on, Mason would quietly position himself where he could see it and refuse to look anywhere else. The park's veterinarian found nothing unusual. Maintenance crews inspected the enclosure for hidden noises or electrical problems. They even replaced the camera with a brand new unit, assuming the old one emitted a faint sound humans couldn't hear. The moment the replacement was activated, Mason slowly turned his head, found the new lens, and stared directly into it, as if he had never lost sight of it at all. The staff exchanged nervous glances that no one wanted to put into words. Visitors began asking whether something dangerous had happened. Parents quietly pulled their children closer whenever Mason fixed his unblinking eyes toward the camera. Lucas tried to reassure everyone that the silverback had never shown aggression, yet deep down he felt an unfamiliar knot forming in his stomach. It wasn't fear of Mason. It was fear that Mason might be trying to tell them something they had completely failed to understand. Late that afternoon, wildlife behavior specialist Dr. Olivia Carter arrived carrying a tablet filled with surveillance footage. She watched exactly 30 seconds before asking the control room to freeze the image, zoom in frame by frame, and magnify the reflection inside the camera housing. The room fell silent as the picture slowly sharpened, and what appeared in the corner of the screen made every person there forget to breathe. No one in the control room spoke after the image froze on the screen. Dr. Olivia Carter quietly asked the technician not to enhance it any further until she could verify what they were seeing with the original recording. Lucas remained standing behind her, his eyes drifting away from the monitor and back toward the habitat outside. Through the large observation window, Mason had not moved. He was still sitting on the same weathered ledge with remarkable patience, his broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, even breaths. There was nothing threatening about him. In fact, the longer Lucas watched, the more he realized the enormous silverback looked exhausted rather than alert, almost like someone carrying a burden that no one else could see. Over the next several days, Lucas quietly changed his routine. Instead of greeting Mason from the main entrance each morning, he arrived before sunrise and observed from a distance. The younger gorillas chased one another across the grass, climbed wooden platforms, and searched for hidden treats placed by the enrichment staff. Mason usually enjoyed joining those games. He had always been the calm center of the troop, gently settling disagreements with little more than a glance. Now he barely acknowledged them. He waited for the first security camera to activate, lifted his eyes toward it, and remained there in complete silence. Lucas tried tempting him with Mason's favorite snacks, including fresh watermelon slices and roasted sweet potatoes prepared exactly the way he liked them. Mason accepted the food politely, ate only enough to satisfy his hunger, and then returned to the exact same position facing the camera. He never appeared frightened. He never looked angry. If anything, there was an unmistakable sadness in his expression that Lucas had never seen before. It was the kind of quiet sadness that lingered long after visitors had gone home and the pathways outside the habitat became empty. Dr. Olivia reviewed years of behavioral records, searching for anything remotely similar. Mason had adapted well after arriving at Ridge Valley Wildlife Park several years earlier. He trusted his keepers, responded well to training sessions, and showed an unusual ability to recognize familiar faces even after long absences. Nothing in his history explained why a simple security camera had suddenly become the center of his world. The staff avoided discussing their growing concern in front of guests, but whispers spread through the park anyway. Some employees believed Mason was reacting to a reflection. Others wondered if he could hear a faint mechanical sound. None of those explanations felt convincing. Lucas noticed something even more unsettling. Whenever the maintenance crew powered the camera down for testing, Mason did not relax. He simply lowered his head and waited in complete silence, almost as though he knew the camera would soon awaken again. The instant its tiny indicator light returned, his eyes slowly lifted to meet the lens with heartbreaking determination. It looked less like curiosity and more like relief. Late one evening, after the park had closed and the habitats were nearly dark, Lucas stopped outside the enclosure one final time before heading home. Mason was resting beneath a large oak tree, his eyes finally closed. For the first time in days, Lucas thought the silverback had found a moment of peace. Then, without opening his eyes or lifting his head, Mason quietly stretched one arm toward the distant camera, his fingers stopping in midair as though reaching for something that was never supposed to be there. The following morning, the atmosphere around Mason's habitat felt noticeably different. Word had quietly spread among the staff that the silverback's unusual routine was becoming more difficult to explain. Lucas arrived before sunrise expecting another silent vigil toward the camera, but this time, Mason did something no one had ever documented before. Instead of settling immediately onto his favorite limestone ledge, he slowly walked the perimeter of the enclosure with deliberate precision, stopping every few yards to glance toward the camera before continuing. It was almost as if he were measuring invisible distances that only he understood. When he completed the circle, he returned to the exact center of the habitat, carefully gathered several small branches scattered across the ground, and laid them out one by one in a neat curved line facing the camera. The arrangement was unlike any enrichment behavior recorded in his file. He was not building a nest, searching for food, or entertaining himself. He simply positioned each branch, stepped back, examined the pattern, then quietly removed one piece and replaced it a few inches away. Visitors watched in complete silence, unsure whether they were witnessing intelligence or something far more unsettling. Children who usually laughed at Mason's playful personality now stayed close to their parents. Lucas entered the service corridor and observed through a side window. The moment a groundskeeper accidentally stepped between the camera and Mason's line of sight while cleaning the visitor pathway, Mason immediately stood up. He did not vocalize or charge. Instead, he gently tapped the enclosure glass 3 slow times with the back of his fingers. As soon as the worker moved away, Mason relaxed and returned to his carefully arranged branches. The gesture repeated itself twice more that morning, always calm, always controlled, always triggered by someone blocking the camera's view. Dr. Olivia requested continuous observation, convinced that every detail mattered. Motion sensors, environmental readings, and audio equipment detected nothing unusual. Wind speed remained normal. Lighting conditions changed throughout the day. Wildlife sounds came and went from neighboring habitats. Yet Mason's strange routine adapted perfectly to every change, as though his attention was fixed on something entirely independent of the environment around him. By the 4th afternoon, another unexpected behavior emerged. Every hour, almost to the minute, Mason slowly rotated his body exactly 90 degrees before returning to face the camera again. The timing was so consistent that technicians checked the surveillance system for synchronization errors, believing perhaps a hidden signal was influencing him. They found nothing. Lucas began losing sleep. He had spent years learning to recognize the smallest changes in gorilla behavior, but everything Mason was doing existed outside every pattern he knew. Some employees quietly suggested transferring the silverback to an off-exhibit medical facility for extensive evaluation. Others worried that whatever was happening could suddenly become unpredictable in front of visitors. Lucas resisted the idea, insisting Mason had never shown signs of aggression, but even he could no longer explain what he was seeing. Late that evening, after the last guests had left and the habitat lights dimmed, Mason approached the viewing glass carrying the final branch from his strange arrangement. Instead of placing it on the ground, he slowly lifted it toward the camera until its tip aligned perfectly beneath the lens. He held it there without moving for nearly a full minute, then gently lowered the branch, stepped backward, and, for the first time since the mystery began, deliberately covered his own eyes with both hands while continuing to face the camera. Lucas barely recognized the quiet confidence that had once defined the staff meetings. Every conversation now ended with the same uneasy silence. Nobody believed Mason was dangerous, yet nobody could explain him anymore either. That uncertainty slowly became its own kind of fear. The park administration began receiving emails from concerned visitors who had watched videos circulating online. Some claimed the silverback appeared disturbed. Others insisted his repetitive behavior suggested severe psychological decline. One family even canceled their annual membership after saying they no longer felt comfortable bringing their children near the western habitat. The comments were painful for Lucas to read because they described an animal he knew did not exist. They were not afraid of Mason because he had frightened anyone. They were afraid because they could no longer understand him. During the following week, administrators quietly reduced public access to the exhibit. Temporary signs redirected guests toward other areas of the park, while maintenance barriers appeared outside the viewing glass. Children who arrived hoping to see the famous silverback were gently told that the habitat was undergoing routine observation. Mason noticed the change immediately. Instead of crowds filling the walkway each morning, only a handful of employees remained. He slowly approached the empty glass, looked around the unusually quiet visitor area, then returned to his familiar position facing the camera. Lucas felt a heavy ache watching him. For years, Mason had calmly accepted the presence of thousands of strangers every season. Now those same people were avoiding him because of a mystery he could not explain. Dr. Olivia continued reviewing every report she could find, arguing that removing Mason from his routine before understanding the behavior might erase the very clues they were trying to study. But pressure continued building from outside the research team. Insurance consultants recommended limiting exposure until a definitive explanation could be documented. A behavioral review panel scheduled an emergency meeting for Friday morning. Lucas attended with folders full of observation notes, hoping facts would outweigh fear. Instead, the discussion focused on uncertainty. One specialist suggested Mason might be developing an obsessive fixation that could worsen over time. Another warned that unpredictable behavioral changes, even without aggression, could place unnecessary stress on both the animal and the park. None of them accused Mason of being dangerous. Their conclusion was colder than that. They believed he was no longer emotionally stable enough to remain where he was. Lucas argued that the silverback still interacted gently with his troop, responded to familiar voices, and followed every daily routine except the unexplained focus on the camera. His words filled the room, but failed to change the mood. The committee preferred caution over patience. That afternoon, Lucas returned to the habitat carrying the disappointing news in silence. Mason walked toward him with his usual calm expression, stopping just a few feet from the service gate. For a long moment, neither moved. Lucas rested one hand against the barrier, while Mason quietly mirrored the gesture from the opposite side. It was a simple routine they had shared countless times over the years, yet now it felt painfully fragile. Before leaving for the evening, Lucas glanced at the printed notice that had just arrived from park management. Beginning at sunrise the next day, Mason would be transferred to an isolated observation enclosure away from visitors, away from his troop, and away from the only camera he had refused to stop watching. Lucas stayed long after his shift ended, unable to accept that sunrise would separate Mason from everything familiar. The habitat had fallen completely silent except for the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the park's maintenance vehicles. Most of the staff had already gone home, but Dr. Olivia Carter remained inside the surveillance office reviewing environmental logs one final time before the transfer paperwork became official. She no longer searched for dramatic evidence. She was simply hoping to confirm that every possible explanation had already been ruled out. As she compared maintenance schedules with behavioral records, one tiny inconsistency caught her attention. It was so insignificant that dozens of people had overlooked it. Every morning, exactly 3 minutes before Mason began his unusual routine, the environmental monitoring software automatically performed a diagnostic cycle on the equipment mounted along the visitor barrier. The system checked power levels, temperature sensors, network connections, and image calibration before opening the live security feed. None of those reports showed mechanical failure, yet one value appeared almost every day in the same location. A calibration warning flashed for less than half a second before disappearing. It never triggered an alarm because the reading remained inside acceptable limits, but it always appeared on the same device facing Mason's enclosure. Curious, Olivia pulled archived logs from previous months. Before Mason's strange behavior began, the warning had never appeared. The timing was too precise to ignore. She walked outside with Lucas and quietly pointed toward the equipment mounted above the observation glass. It looked perfectly ordinary beneath the evening lights. There were no loose panels, no damaged wiring, and no visible defects. Lucas admitted he had walked beneath that housing hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. Olivia asked him an unexpected question. Had anyone ever physically examined the mounting bracket itself rather than only testing the electronics? Lucas paused before answering. Every inspection had focused on software, cameras, lenses, and cables. No one had removed the protective cover because the diagnostics always reported normal operation. Olivia stared at the narrow metal housing for several seconds before looking back toward Mason. The silverback was not watching the camera anymore. Instead, he had quietly shifted a few feet to one side, positioning himself where the late afternoon sunlight reflected across the underside of the mounting bracket. He remained completely still until a passing cloud blocked the sunlight. The instant the reflection disappeared, Mason slowly lowered his head and stepped back to his usual place. Lucas felt a chill despite the warm summer air. That movement was different from everything they had documented before. Mason had not reacted to the lens, the visitors, or the equipment itself. He had reacted to a brief reflection that lasted only seconds. Olivia immediately searched the maintenance archives again and discovered another overlooked detail. The calibration warning always occurred shortly after sunrise, exactly when sunlight reached that section of the visitor walkway from the east. She could not explain why those two events seemed connected, but coincidence no longer felt like a satisfying answer. She closed her laptop, looked at Lucas with quiet determination, and said they needed permission to delay the transfer until they could remove the entire camera assembly and inspect every inch of the structure behind it before anyone made a mistake they could never undo. Park management reluctantly agreed to postpone Mason's transfer for exactly 1 hour. It was not because they believed he was right. It was because Dr. Olivia convinced them that removing the camera assembly required less time than relocating a 700-pound silverback into a temporary enclosure. Just before sunrise, maintenance workers rolled a lift into the empty visitor walkway while Lucas stood beside Olivia, watching every movement. Mason had already taken his usual place, but something immediately felt different. Instead of facing the lens, he kept glancing toward the workers, then back toward the metal housing above them. His breathing became slightly faster, yet he never displayed panic. He simply waited. As the technician loosened the final bolts holding the protective cover in place, Olivia asked everyone to stop using power tools and continue by hand. She wanted nothing to disturb whatever Mason had been trying to show them. The cover slowly separated from the mounting bracket by less than an inch. At that exact moment, Mason rose to his full height for the first time in days. Lucas instinctively tensed, expecting another unexplained behavior. Instead, Mason extended one arm toward the camera, not in alarm, but almost, as if urging them to continue. The technician carefully widened the opening until daylight slipped inside the narrow metal cavity. Everyone leaned closer. At first they saw nothing except wiring and insulation. Then Olivia noticed an object wedged deep behind the support plate, where no routine inspection would ever reveal it. It was not part of the camera system at all. A tiny emergency locator beacon, no larger than a deck of cards, had become trapped inside the housing after apparently breaking free from a research drone used weeks earlier during wildlife mapping outside the park. The damaged beacon still emitted an almost invisible infrared pulse every few seconds. Humans could not see it with the naked eye, but the maintenance engineer activated a diagnostic viewer, and the hidden flashes instantly appeared across the screen. Olivia's mind raced. Gorillas possess exceptional visual perception under certain lighting conditions, and the sunrise reflection they had documented perfectly aligned with each pulse escaping through a narrow crack beneath the bracket. Mason had never been fascinated by the camera. He had been watching the strange repeating signal that no person had realized was there. The engineer disconnected the beacon, and the faint infrared pulse vanished immediately. Lucas slowly turned toward the habitat. Without hesitation, Mason lowered his arm, walked away from the viewing glass for the first time in more than a week, and quietly joined the younger gorillas grazing in the morning grass, as though an enormous weight had finally been lifted. There was no celebration from him, no dramatic display, no sign that he expected praise. He simply returned to being himself. Silence filled the visitor walkway. Olivia looked down at the maintenance reports they had trusted, then back at the empty bracket that had nearly cost Mason his home. Lucas felt his chest tighten as every confusing moment suddenly made perfect sense. The branches, the careful positioning, the reflections, the waiting, even the way Mason had covered his own eyes had never been random. He had been trying, in every peaceful way he knew, to direct human attention toward a problem they were incapable of seeing. Lucas removed the transfer notice from his clipboard, folded it in half with trembling hands, and stood speechless, realizing the one individual everyone believed needed saving had been patiently trying to protect them from their own mistake all along. The maintenance crew stood frozen around the open camera housing, but Mason never looked back to see whether anyone was applauding him. He had already settled beside the younger gorillas, gently accepting a playful tug from one of the juveniles before quietly returning to his morning routine, as though the entire mystery had never been about him at all. That simple moment struck Lucas harder than any speech could have. Mason had spent days sacrificing his own comfort, allowing people to question his health, his intelligence, and even his future, yet the instant the hidden signal disappeared, he asked for nothing in return. Lucas slowly walked to the edge of the habitat and remained there without speaking. Memories began rushing back with painful clarity. He remembered the 3 soft taps against the glass whenever someone unknowingly blocked the camera. At the time, he had assumed Mason was becoming obsessive. Now he understood those taps had never been demands for attention. They had been patient attempts to keep the line of sight clear. He remembered the careful arrangement of branches that had puzzled everyone. Looking back toward the open bracket, Lucas suddenly realized the curved pattern had perfectly matched the angle of the morning sunlight reflecting beneath the camera housing. Mason had not been playing. He had been recreating the path of the strange flashes using the only tools available to him. Even the heartbreaking moment when Mason covered his own eyes finally carried a completely different meaning. Lucas had believed the silverback was shutting himself off from the world. Instead, Mason had silently demonstrated that when the reflection disappeared, the signal disappeared with it. Every confusing behavior had been a clue placed carefully in front of people who simply had not learned how to read it. Dr. Olivia quietly replayed the surveillance recordings from the previous week without audio. Watching them in silence transformed the story entirely. The giant gorilla no longer looked disturbed or withdrawn. He looked determined. Every movement appeared deliberate, measured, and incredibly restrained. She closed the final video and removed the behavioral concern label from Mason's digital record herself. Then she opened a new report with a completely different title describing an extraordinary example of sustained problem-directed communication. Around the office, employees who had once supported the transfer request slowly collected the printed documents they had signed only hours earlier. No one argued. No one defended the earlier decision. One by one, the pages were quietly placed into the recycling bin. It was a small gesture, yet it carried the weight of an apology that words could not express. Lucas entered the habitat later that afternoon, carrying nothing except a folding stool. Instead of calling Mason over as he usually did, he simply sat near the service fence and waited. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the silverback calmly approached. Mason stopped only a few feet away and studied Lucas's face with the same quiet expression he had worn throughout the entire ordeal. Lucas did not reach through the barrier or offer treats. He simply placed his hand over his own heart and gave a slow nod of respect. Mason watched him for a moment, then mirrored the gesture in his own way by resting one broad hand gently against his chest before turning back toward his family. Lucas smiled through eyes that had become impossible to keep dry. Before leaving the enclosure, he walked directly to the administration office with Dr. Olivia and requested that every transfer order, restriction notice, and behavioral review concerning Mason be permanently canceled, because the one animal everyone believed needed to be separated had earned something far more important instead: their complete trust. The changes at Ridge Valley Wildlife Park began quietly, not with a celebration, but with a promise. Lucas and Dr. Olivia agreed that earning Mason's trust again would require more than canceling paperwork. It would require proving that people could learn as carefully as he had tried to teach them. The damaged camera housing was removed completely, and before a replacement was installed, engineers redesigned the entire mounting system so every enclosed device could be inspected from the outside without dismantling the structure. What had once been dismissed as routine maintenance became a new safety standard throughout the park. Every keeper attended workshops explaining Mason's behavior, not as an unusual incident, but as a reminder that intelligence sometimes appears in forms humans do not immediately recognize. Visitors gradually returned to the western habitat, but the atmosphere had changed. Instead of whispering fearful questions, families stood quietly reading a new educational display created by Dr. Olivia. It did not portray Mason as a miracle or a mystery. It described him as an individual whose persistence had challenged experienced professionals to look beyond their assumptions. Children spent long minutes studying the illustrations that recreated the sequence of clues he had patiently left behind. Many of them tried arranging small wooden sticks into curved patterns at the nearby learning station, smiling when they discovered how sunlight changed the reflections throughout the morning. Lucas noticed something remarkable during those first weeks. Mason no longer positioned himself near the visitor glass when the cameras activated each day. Instead, he returned to habits everyone had almost forgotten. He climbed the large oak platform with the younger gorillas, searched for hidden treats tucked inside puzzle feeders, and often rested beneath the same tree where he had once reached toward the distant camera. It felt as though an invisible weight had finally disappeared from his daily life. Lucas also introduced one small change to his own routine. Every morning before visitors entered the park, he placed a simple polished metal disc on a low wooden stand outside the habitat. It reflected the sunrise for only a few minutes before the angle of the light changed. Mason would usually glance toward it once, pause for a second, and then calmly continue with his day. Lucas never viewed the gesture as a test. It was simply his quiet way of saying that someone was finally paying attention. Weeks later, Dr. Olivia received approval to publish the behavioral findings for conservation teams across the country. She insisted that Mason's name remain attached to the report because discoveries should honor those who make them possible, regardless of whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. The document encouraged researchers to spend more time asking why an animal repeated a behavior before deciding it was meaningless. One peaceful autumn morning, Lucas watched from a distance as school children gathered outside the habitat. A little girl pointed toward Mason and asked why everyone seemed to admire him so much. Before any adult could answer, another child quietly replied, "Because he kept trying to help even when nobody believed him." Lucas smiled without interrupting. Across the enclosure, Mason lifted his head for only a moment, calmly observing the children before returning to the younger gorillas, who happily followed him through the golden grass. There was no hesitation in his movements anymore, no searching, no waiting, only the steady confidence of an animal who no longer needed to convince anyone that his voice mattered because, at last, the people around him had learned how to listen. Seasons passed, and the strange week that had once filled the park with uncertainty slowly became part of its history, but it was never forgotten. New employees learned about Mason during their very first days of training, not because he had done something impossible, but because he had reminded experienced professionals that understanding always begins with observation rather than assumption. Lucas noticed that visitors no longer hurried through the Western habitat with cameras raised above their heads searching for dramatic moments. Instead, many simply stood quietly, watching the troupe live ordinary lives. Children laughed as the younger gorillas chased one another through the grass, while Mason rested nearby, beneath the broad branches of the old oak tree. Sometimes he joined their games with gentle confidence. Other times he simply watched over them with the calm patience that had always been part of who he was. Lucas often smiled at the thought that nothing about Mason had truly changed. The only thing that had changed was the way people finally chose to see him. Every year, on the anniversary of the discovery, Dr. Olivia gathered new interns beside the visitor walkway just after sunrise. She never began with scientific terms or technical reports. Instead, she asked everyone to remain silent for 1 full minute and simply notice the sounds, the light, the shadows, and the quiet routines unfolding inside the habitat. Only afterward did she explain that the greatest mistakes in wildlife research rarely happen because people lacked intelligence. They happened because people stopped paying attention when an answer did not arrive in the form they expected. Those words stayed with many young researchers long after they left the park. Lucas carried the lesson home as well. He found himself listening more carefully to the people around him, slowing down before reaching conclusions, and remembering that behavior always tells a story, even when the language is unfamiliar. More than once he caught himself smiling at the polished metal disc that still reflected the first light of every morning. It had become a quiet tradition rather than an experiment. Mason no longer paused to study it for long. Occasionally, he glanced toward the reflection for only a heartbeat before continuing with his day, almost as if he knew the message had already been received. On one peaceful autumn afternoon, the park welcomed a group of children visiting for their first wildlife education program. As they prepared to leave, one little boy looked back at Mason and asked Lucas whether the gorilla remembered everything that had happened. Lucas watched Mason gently guide one curious youngster away from a muddy patch before answering with a soft smile. "I do not know what he remembers," he said, "but I know he never stopped trying to help us understand." The boy nodded thoughtfully before taking his mother's hand and walking away. Mason remained beneath the golden trees surrounded by his family, completely at peace, needing nothing more than the life he had quietly protected all along. Sometimes the wisest voice is the one that never speaks, and the greatest kindness is learning to finally listen.